It is 3:25 p.m. on Monday, January 27th. It is actually daylight currently when I'm recording this. Normally it's a little bit later. That brings me to what I want to talk about is that I severely dislike daylight savings or the fallback part of daylight savings because I don't wake up early enough to enjoy the sunlight in the morning. So I want my sunlight to be in the afternoon. Like, I would love to, instead of sun setting at 4 o'clock in December, early January, the sun will set at 5. And that will it gives you more time throughout the day to actually do things, because whether the sun rises at 7 or at 8, I don't think anybody particularly cares. Sure, some people may go to work in the dark or do a bunch of other things. Like, I don't care. If people are waking up that early, they're not concerned if it's light or dark. They're just concerned if they're awake enough. And then, that brings to another thing, is that there's actually a mental health problem with daylight savings, and it's literally called seasonal depression. That's a huge thing that happens. It's when, you're stuck inside, there's limited things to do, but it's also the idea that, sunlight is a big thing for mental health. Being able to be outside, it's daylight, natural light, for me at least, is pretty important. But natural light is healthy for somebody. And in the winter, when there's less of it, and especially in schools when stresses are already abnormally high, you get out of class and you have 1 hour or 2 hours of daylight. It's pretty unhealthy. It is not necessarily a good thing. And so I dislike that immensely. I had one class last year that I would get out, even now, I would get out at 3:50. I would start walking outside, and golden hour had already have passed. It was so much, it was sad. Because I want to enjoy the sunlight, and if you're in classes all day, you can't enjoy it. And maybe, people would say enjoy the sunlight. It may not necessarily be, I want to be outside and doing things. It's like what I'm doing now. I'm in a classroom, all the lights are off, and all the windows are open. I'm just letting natural light come in. And it just feels nice. It's comforting to me. And I think a lot of people would find it that way, because that's why there's a disease, not a disease, issue. But also, there's a graph that I've seen that I really like, and it is this graph depicting the daylight savings for different times. Here, let me zoom out just a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah. And, the big thing about the graph is that it depicts, days with reasonable sunrise time, 7 a.m. or earlier throughout the entire year. What we have now with daylight savings, if daylight saving times was abolished, if daylight savings time were always in effect. So, if you look at the graph, sure, the East Coast times are or not the East. In each time zone, the west side of the time zone looks exactly the same as the west side if daylight savings was always in effect. But if the daylight savings time was abolished, the East Coast time looks exactly the same as the East Coast time in the time that we always have. And then this is when sunset 6 p.m. or later. And what we have now absolutely sucks. So I hate it. So I'm not arguing for daylight savings time to be abolished, because this is arguably worse, because it favors towards it favors towards having more time throughout the day. Like 7 a.m. or earlier, the people that are getting up at 7 a.m. are getting up because they have to, not necessarily because they want to per se. At least the majority of them. I know I have a friend here who will wake up at 5 a.m. and go for a run every single day, and he is an absolute psycho. But it's just not normal. And like I said, people are willing to bet that they would rather have more times later throughout the day. And if we go down to the bottom with if we were always in effect, then sure, we'll have less time before sunrise before 7 a.m. But the amount of time we'll have daylight time like after 6 p.m. is exponentially greater. And there's actually a majority of the time zones that have it at all times. Like, this is just infinitely better. I don't understand why people have that. And the argument that's like, oh, it's for farmers. Farmers do not care if they're in light or dark. That was an old time thing, and the time has passed. And like, technically, Congress, I think, had a resolution about that. But I'm like 90% sure it got stuck in Congress, but also they don't find it's not important enough to them because it doesn't make them any money. Or, I'm not going to talk politics, but it's not worth it to them because this is not an important issue. It's for comfort of the people. And I feel like the majority of people have it because there's a standard. It's called standard time. And I'm pretty sure Nevada, one of the West Coast states, are in standard time. And it's really frustrating. So you're driving around there, and just imagine this. You're driving around. You go into one time zone, you're an hour later. You go into Nevada or Arizona or whatever it is, and then you're in a different time zone. Then you come back and you're 2 hours ahead. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Like, it just doesn't. You shouldn't have that. It shouldn't be like that. And it's so annoying. Because people do not care if you're daylight before that time. People care if it's daylight after, because when people will go to work in the morning, like, it's instead take it outside of a school scenario, because school is, I guess, the same thing as work. Is that people wake up, they don't care about anything because they're just going to go to work or to school, and then they do everything when it's sunlight, and then they come home like a 9 to 5. Like, you're going to come home in the dark. That's depressing. If you're able to have that sunlight later, infinitely better. If you think of it as like, as a thing for parents, you come home and you can do things with your children out in the light. If you're out here, you can just enjoy a classroom with natural light and just soak in the sun, instead of being under artificial light and having to do work in a dark corner of a classroom. Keeping daylight savings all year round is infinitely better, because seasonal depression is a real thing. It afflicts many students. And if you're not from an area that is more winter focused, like, I grew up in areas that were always winter focused, mostly because they were high in the mountains. So I'm used to the winter depression and the winterness of everything. And some people aren't. And they get they catch a case of seasonal depression hard. And it's a struggle for them. I've known many people at boarding school and college that catch those cases, and it's tough for them. And the only way to not have that happen is to have daylight later. It's annoying because it makes sense. And why is it that other countries don't do it? Other states don't do it. So why is it a thing? People just don't want it. I want daylight. Daylight is nice.